3 boys. No money, no name, no one waiting to hand them anything. One dropped out of school at 11 to work on a ferry boat. One left his home country as a child because his family was starving. One grew up in a house so poor, his mother took in laundry just to buy food. By the time they died, they controlled more money than most countries on Earth. But money was never really the point. It was leverage. One man decided which cities got connected by rail, and which ones got left behind to die. One man's mill set the price of the steel that built America's skyscrapers, its bridges, and eventually its warships. One man controlled so much of the nation's oil that senators showed up at his office, not the other way around, because Standard Oil could make or break their next election with a single check. History calls them robber barons. But that word hides half the story. This is what it actually took to go from nothing to owning everything. Staten Island, New York, early 1800s. Cornelius Vanderbilt is 11 years old, and he's already done with school. His father runs a small ferry business, moving goods across New York Harbor. Cornelius doesn't want a classroom. He wants a boat. At 16, he borrows $100 from his mother, buys his own small ferry, and starts hauling passengers and cargo across the water himself. He works harder than every other ferryman on the harbor. Longer hours, lower prices. He earns a nickname that will follow him his entire life, the Commodore. By his 30s, Vanderbilt doesn't just run a ferry, he owns a fleet of steamships. He undercuts every competitor so aggressively that rival companies eventually pay him just to leave their routes alone. It's not really competition anymore. It's a threat with a smile. Then, in his 60s, when most men are slowing down, Vanderbilt does something almost nobody expects. He looks at the steamship empire he spent 40 years building, and he starts selling it off. Because he's seen the future, and it isn't on the water. It's on rails. He pours his fortune into railroads, buying up small, disconnected lines and welding them into one unstoppable network. The New York Central. Lines stretching from New York to Chicago. For the first time, freight and passengers can move across the country without switching trains a dozen times. Vanderbilt becomes the richest man in America. When he dies in 1877, he leaves behind more money than the entire United States Treasury holds at that moment. But here's the part people forget. Vanderbilt didn't build his empire by playing fair. He crashed stock prices on purpose, flooding the market with shares just to wipe out investors who crossed him. He once wrote to 2 former business partners who'd tried to outmaneuver him, warning them that he wouldn't bother suing. He'd simply ruin them. He kept that promise. Workers on his ships and railroads were paid as little as he could get away with, and when they pushed back, he simply replaced them. He gave almost nothing to charity for most of his life, calling public opinion a waste of his time. To Vanderbilt, business wasn't about building a country. It was about winning, and he intended to win at anyone's expense. The second man started even lower. Andrew Carnegie is born in Scotland, into poverty so severe his family emigrates to America with almost nothing. At age 13, he is working 13-hour days in a cotton mill, earning $1.20 a week. Then he worked as a telegraph messenger boy, memorizing the streets of Pittsburgh so fast he becomes the fastest runner on the payroll. He teaches himself Morse code at night, just to move up. That hunger never leaves him. By his 20s, Carnegie is investing in railroads and iron. By his 40s, he's building something bigger than anyone in America has ever built before. A steel empire. His mills run on the newest technology and the lowest costs of any competitor in the country. Carnegie Steel becomes the largest steel producer on the planet. The rails, the bridges, the skyscrapers of a growing America, almost all of it runs through his furnaces. And Carnegie doesn't just want to be rich. He wants to be remembered as good. He writes essays about the moral duty of wealthy men to give their fortunes back to society. He builds public libraries, over 2,500 of them, in towns across America and beyond, so that any poor boy like he once was could educate himself for free. But behind the libraries was a man who once called himself a friend of labor in public, while quietly demanding his mills push workers to 12-hour shifts 7 days a week for wages that kept shrinking year after year. In 1892, Carnegie sails off to Scotland, right as a labor contract at his homestead plant is set to expire. He leaves his partner, Henry Clay Frick, with total authority, and Frick uses it to slash wages, lock the workers out, and surround the plant with a 3-mile fence lined with rifle holes. When armed Pinkerton guards arrive by barge to break the strike, the workers fight back. By the end of the day, several men on both sides are dead. Carnegie says nothing publicly. He lets Frick take the blame in every newspaper while he stays safely across the ocean, the same man who'd spent years writing essays about a rich man's moral duty to the poor. The man who built libraries for the poor, let his own workers bleed for a raise, and never once said their names. Richford, New York. John D. Rockefeller's father is a con man who sells fake medicine and vanishes for months at a time. His mother is left to raise the family alone, stretching every penny, teaching young John a lesson he never forgets. Control what you can control, and never depend on luck. At 16, Rockefeller gets his first job as an assistant bookkeeper. He's meticulous, obsessive even. Every cent is tracked, every expense questioned. He keeps a personal ledger of his earnings and giving for his entire life, a habit that starts when he's a teenager making almost nothing. He doesn't drink, he doesn't gamble. He goes to church every Sunday, without fail. In his 20s, Rockefeller enters the oil business at exactly the right moment, right as America starts running on kerosene. But he doesn't just drill for oil. He goes after refining, the part of the business most people ignore. He builds Standard Oil, and he builds it ruthlessly. He negotiates secret deals with railroads for lower shipping rates that his competitors can't get. He buys out rivals one by one, sometimes generously, sometimes by squeezing them until they have no choice. Within a few decades, Standard Oil controls nearly 90% of all oil refined in the United States. It is the largest, most feared monopoly the country has ever seen. In 1911, the U.S. Supreme Court finally breaks it apart into more than 30 separate companies. Companies that still exist today, in different names: Exxon, Chevron, Mobil. By then, Rockefeller is the richest man who has ever lived in any country at any point in history when adjusted for the size of the economy around him. But the 90% didn't come from being the best at making oil. It came from secret railroad rebates his rivals never even knew existed. Rockefeller got paid a cut every time a competitor's oil shipped, on top of his own. It came from underpricing a rival city by city until the smaller company collapsed, then buying its wreckage for pennies. Men who refused to sell to him sometimes found their businesses ruined within months, their names quietly blacklisted across the industry. Cartoonists of the era draw him as an octopus, its tentacles wrapped around Congress, the courts, and entire state governments. A journalist named Ida Tarbell had her own reason to go after him. Her father's business had been crushed by Standard Oil years earlier. She spent years exposing exactly how it was done. It was her reporting that helped bring the empire down in court. And yet, this is the same man who, every single week, gave away dimes to strangers on the street and quietly funded medical research that helped cure hookworm and yellow fever across the American South. The most feared businessman in America was also, by some measures, the most generous. 3 different boys, 3 different industries: water and rail, steel, oil. But strip away the ships, the furnaces, the pipelines, and you find the exact same man 3 times over. Each one started with nothing, and each one learned young that nobody was coming to save them. Vanderbilt on a ferry deck, Carnegie running telegraph messages through Pittsburgh's streets. Rockefeller keeping a ledger of coins his family couldn't afford to lose. Each one didn't just enter an industry. He found the one part of it everyone else was ignoring, and he owned it completely. Vanderbilt saw rail before his rivals did. Carnegie mastered the furnace, not just the finished steel. Rockefeller went after refining, while everyone else chased the oil in the ground. And each one built something the country still runs on today, while leaving behind workers who were paid too little, and competitors who were crushed without mercy. That's the uncomfortable truth about all three of them. The libraries, the hospitals, the universities they funded were real. So were the broken strikes, the crushed rivals, the fortunes built on other men's backs. They weren't just robber barons, and they weren't just builders. They were both at the exact same time. And history still hasn't decided which one to remember them as. So here's the question worth sitting with. If a boy with nothing showed up today, with that same hunger, that same willingness to crush anyone in his path to build something the world would depend on for a century, would you call him a visionary? Or would you call him exactly what they were called in their own time? A robber baron?